Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another week of discussion. This week, we're talking a little bit about sex and power. So, we're first thinking about this topic through Audre Lorde's piece, Uses of the Erotic, Erotic as Power. And Audre Lorde was writing this piece in response to some heated debates of the day. So, she was writing in response to second wave 70s era feminists. Remember them from the from earlier in the semester? So she was writing this piece in response to those second wave feminists that were saying, porn is always 100% a way to reinforce sexist oppression, that we needed to zero in on porn and the porn industry in order to, eliminate a key site of sexist oppression. And what's really important to note is that Audre Lorde felt that this conversation was lacking a lot of nuance and that the byproduct of the conversation around porn was essentially supporting a repression of women's sexuality. So Audre Lorde saw these conversations as essentially defining the repression of sexuality as being a source of power, and Audre Lorde was like, no, no, y'all, we need to talk about eroticism and sexuality a little bit and think a little bit more deeply about these particular topics. So it's important to note that Audre Lorde defined eroticism beyond sexual expression. So for Audre Lorde, eroticism was, this wellspring of power that was connected to the expression of joy and desire and sensuality and pleasure and articulating one's needs and wants. And it went beyond that, sense of like sexual gratification or sexual expression. And in defining eroticism in this way, Audre Lorde notes that, it was a key source of power. It was a key source of being able to understand oneself and grow into oneself and, become an actualized, version of oneself. So Audre Lorde notes that, of course, the nature of oppression, in order to perpetuate itself, is to take various forms of power and distort them or misuse them. And she sees that happening in various ways with certain forms of porn. So she notes that, yes, like there is this cultural misuse of women's eroticism and sexuality, but we need to think about how we can disentangle, porn's depiction of, women's sexuality or eroticism and, think about how it is something that, we need to get to the source of and understand as, being this really key site of, growth and power. So, thinking about, the way Audre Lorde articulated eroticism, it was, something that was very much intertwined with, these porn debates. And we'll talk more about, porn and sex work in the weeks to come and think about, how that's obviously been a hot issue in feminist conversations for many years. But in relation to this particular conversation, specifically thinking about how, the expression of eroticism is something that we can understand as, going beyond just sexual expression. So there's that, and then we're also thinking about this E. Hammond's piece where the author dives into how, cultural images and depictions of black and white women's sexuality have functioned and how they've functioned in accordance with, various mechanisms of white supremacy, and looking specifically at, the ways that white women's sexuality has been portrayed since the 1800s in relation to Victorian ideals. There's been this desexed or puritanical ideal associated with white women, and that has been cast in a binary opposition to various cultural depictions of black women's sexuality, where there's been, these various depictions of immorality that mainstream media since the 1800s had depicted. And diving into what is problematic about those depictions and how those depictions continue to be seen in today's day and age is something that we're going to look at. So first up, in order to think about how E. Hammond's argument takes shape, we can even think about the recent controversy with Lana Del Rey's comments in April. So, if folks didn't hear about this particular story, I'll offer an article that provides a little bit of context on it. But the long and short of it was that Lana Del Rey essentially, identified these various women of color in music as being very distinct from her and her expression of sexuality. And she said that she felt like there was no space for her and being very fragile and delicate in her expression of sexuality. So we see how those ideas that Hammonds is pointing to, where Victorian era ideals of being white women being very delicate and whatnot, how that is very harmful because it reinforces this kind of binary opposition that we see continue to play out in the mainstream. And then with that, Lana Del Rey was making invisible the struggle of women of color in music to get their due and to get their credit, and is basically saying that like women of color like receive all this attention, and that like she as a a fragile delicate person does not receive the same type of attention. With that, we can also recognize the ways that Lana Del Rey was positioning different women of color as that their experiences of being in the limelight and whatnot was like all roses, and that was essentially erasing the heavy critique that folks like Cardi B, like Megan Thee Stallion and whatnot, that they all experience for their expressions of sexuality, for their expressions of self and whatnot. So Lana Del Rey was essentially not turning a blind eye to how those experiences shape up for women of color in the music industry, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on the discussion board. And then finally, the last piece that we're looking at is Jessica Valenti's The Cult of Virginity piece, where Jessica Valenti is concerned with how the contemporary religious right in America has essentially contributed to this purity movement, and a purity movement in the sense of, fostering these ideas around women's worth being wrapped up in the decision to remain abstinent or not. And in doing so, there is this question of autonomy at play. So, we think about how when we wrap up women's worth with, the decision to remain abstinent or not, there's often conversations about this happening for young women when they are very young. So, zeroing in on like the preteen era before, women really have, or people really have the ability to make those decisions for themselves. So we saw that, and this may be a kind of dated reference for people, but like Britney Spears and Jessica Simpson were very much a part of this presence of the purity movement, in the sense that they wore purity rings where they pledged their abstinence to their fathers and whatnot. So this is what Jessica Valenti is pointing to, and how that impacted the cultural imagination around purity. And we see how that's very much intertwined with these age-old conceptions of Victorian puritanical ideals and whatnot, and how they continue to reinforce themselves. And it's important to distinguish that, when we're thinking about, women's worth being, tied up with the decision to remain abstinent or not, it's very important to highlight how that decision, can come with full autonomy, can come, for a variety of reasons. But it is important to note how when that decision is made for young women, particularly young women in heavily, religious households at a young age before they're able to make the decision themselves, that's something to grapple with and discuss. So we'll talk about this stuff a little bit more on the discussion board, and I look forward to it.